Now, today's discussion is on environmental, social, and governance, and data science connection to these in corporate. Okay, so all of us know that there are new regulations coming in, new restrictions coming in for different kinds of environmental problems, and of course for governance also. And we should have some kind of social media presence, but as well as there are certain social aspects which are regulating the business in corporate. So essentially we are having a very good panel today. Dr. Anup Kumar Ghosh of IBM Consulting, who is sitting on my right, Mr. Dattatreya Datto of Intuary, sitting on my left, and Mr. Sudipto Ghosh of PwC will be joining online. So the format is like, initially all the three panelists will talk for about 6 minutes each, 6 to 7 minutes each. And then after the three presentations or discussions, there will be a discussion among the panelists about whatever the points they have touched upon. And again, there will be some 6 to 7 minutes for each of them. And finally, we'll open it to the audience for interaction. So that would be the format which we'll follow. So to begin with, I request Dr. Anup Ghosh to say the few words on whatever he thinks about the topic.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully it will warm up a little bit after the food and etc. It's difficult, I know. And actually, this is something as a topic, I mean, environmental, social, and governance, as Professor Majumdar said, initially started off more as a compliance. So it was something the businesses started seeing it as like a cost to the business. And that's why initially there were very lukewarm responses around, right? And I hope that's not the reason why we don't have a full house yet. But what we saw over the years is that response and reaction changed significantly. I mean, while depending on the country we're in, the industry the clients are in, and etc., it varies. Starting from, there are companies who don't care about it, but that number has gone down significantly nowadays. There are some who are doing it because they are required to do it in order to get a license to run their business. So this is more a compliant requirement for them. But what we are seeing of late, that more and more businesses are finding that ESG is not just a cost to their business. This is allowing them newer revenue streams, reaching out to newer sort of customers, helping them grow revenues, in fact, helping them grow profitability as well. And we typically do surveys of the top CEOs of different companies, the others in the CXOs, reach out to the consumers, customers themselves, and etc. And what we have been figuring out, at least 70% odd CXOs, now they believe ESG is a driver for their business growth. It's not just a cost to their doing of the business. If we just move over to the other end of the spectrum, I mean, is it really a driver of business growth or not? So as we surveyed the customers, what we figured out, again, almost 80% of the customers, and again, this is sort of a global data, it will vary by geographies and demographies and etc. They would like to, number one, practice sustainable behaviors and etc. They would want to purchase from companies who practices sustainable behaviors, and they would want to be employed in companies who has those principles and follow those principles, right? So as you can clearly see, there is a demand in the marketplace, which the CIOs and the CEOs and the CXOs of the companies, which they are slowly, see these as opportunities, and that's where ESG is now becoming top of the discussions that are happening around the globe. Now, we looked at the state of where it is. Roughly about, again, some percentages plus or minus, 90% of the companies are having some sort of ESG charters. However, only about 10% has made significant progress on ESGs. And when we flip this question back to the customers or the consumers, what we found out in the last 2 years, the credibility of the company's ESG policies or their call-outs and etc. have gone down significantly with the consumers. Less than half of the consumers really believe the ESG charters that companies has put out. So the credibility of the companies are at stake. So again, when we circle back, what we figured out, we were asking the companies what is preventing them from progressing on this journey. And the topmost reason that came out was data. Either the lack or abundance of data. In most of the cases, it's lack of data. There are lots of data around, we know. I mean, Professor Majumdar spoke about the zettabytes of data and etc. But figuring out what they are about, making sense out of them and using it for the right levels was something which is largely absent, and I will give you some examples. So, absence of data to find out where the companies are today in terms of their ESG postures, what they would need to do better, and how they can cater to the customer's interest was something which the companies were finding it difficult. So almost all the conversation we have with the customers today centers around the data on the ESG front. So I think we have gone over the hump of whether ESG is required for a company. Now it has almost become top of their priority list, but their biggest challenge is about data, and the discussions that happen are about how do we help there, right? And in that you would know, typically we talk of 3 types of measures: the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So things which a company has got in their control, things which companies who are working with these companies, whether they have control over them or not, and then of course the tertiary ones who are supplying to those companies, right? Now, again, depending on the geographies, many companies have got a good grip or slowly getting grips onto what they are doing, things under their control. Again, that is not easy. I mean, for instance, if I just take an example, if we try to even measure a carbon footprint that we are generating as part of this, maybe the panel discussion, it's difficult to find out, right? And again, there had been good progress on that front, but still things are lacking. When we try to figure out how, say, the vendors who are providing the supplies and etc., how they are doing, that becomes even more difficult, right? And by the way, by ESG, it is not just carbon footprint, even though that's sort of the biggest thing which hogs the discussions and etc. It is also about all the other practices, including the social measures as well. And finding carbon footprints most probably is a bit more easier than finding out how different enterprises and different parts of the business are doing on the social front. Becomes even more difficult. And that's where, again, lots of activities are happening, right? So, number one, getting right data. If you get the data, trying to make sense out of it, and then how do you utilize that data to make the progress that you want, or as you have called out in the ESG, is really what is preventing the world from progressing in this front, right? So, I think today's topic is that way really relevant. And I will sometime maybe go into some of what some of the customers globally are doing in this front. And again, as I was mentioning, it's not only just about carbon. As you know, there are 17 SDGs. All of them cover different dimensions of human life. And how would data and then the application of AI and ML technologies and other related technologies can help in this front is what really, I mean, all of us are trying to solve. And happy to discuss that forward.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I mean, it was really the opening bat is really good, I should say. Good amount of runs you got. Now, Mr. Dattatreya Datta.
Thank you, Professor Chandan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here on a very hot Saturday afternoon. Getting right into the topic, I think let's start with why ESG has even come into the forefront. If I were to think from a company that only looks at making money and maintaining a public image, then I'd say that I'm a part of the top 1,000 listed companies right now, and SEBI has asked me that in the next year, from April 2024, I need to start disclosing my ESG reports. And they have a format called the BRSR format, which is essentially a list of 42 questions in which you can either answer yes or no, and give a plan of what you have for the next 5 years to improve your ESG score. Now, why again this is coming in place is because India has made commitments in COP15, COP26 to become net zero by 2070, achieve certain targets by 2030, and to achieve that, its industries need to gear up. But let me tell you that the reporting that we have across the world globally is at it's quite embryonic at this stage. It's not hard-hitting, it's not specific. But the reason for that is to allow companies to have an easier transition. I think some of the challenges pointed out by my esteemed panelist was that data is a problem. And you can only act on something tangible that you have in your hands, and that tangible is data. Because I do not have data, companies do not know how to act. Yes, I need to reduce my carbon, but how? One thing we always need to understand is that we are limited by technology. Technology, while an enabler, is also a limiter. In the previous discussion, it was pointed out that in an open mining landscape situation, I could reduce my diesel usage by 2%, a huge number, but that's because my technology allowed only till 2%. I need to do beyond that because I have aggressive targets for the upcoming years. So how do I do that? I need to improve my S&G scores. S&G scores are perhaps maybe a bit more easier to address because you're addressing the social aspect. While not easy to measure, but it is easier to act upon. G, of course, is even more easier because it's more internal. So the companies can start reporting policies that are helping the current employees. And that, I think, is a way companies can start addressing ESG as a whole. In E, one of the major factors we talk about is carbon footprint, carbon capture, but you also have other aspects such as water pollution, land pollution, soil pollution, air pollution. How do I tackle those? There's this concept of biodiversity and nature capital, which mainly focuses on my usage of natural resources, which is not again accounted for. If I'm drawing fresh water, what is the cost I'm saving because of that? Because fresh water right now is freely available. If I'm polluting an area of land or if I'm polluting a water body, what is the cost I'm saving, I'm incurring because I'm polluting that water body? Instead of that, if I, brought in technology which can not pollute those water bodies, is that cost lower? This is how companies need to start thinking. As rightly mentioned earlier, that process optimization or technology needs to be the DNA of organizations from now on. Similarly, ESG also has to be the DNA of an organization. And they kind of go all hand in hand. While technology is a world of its own and ESG is a world of its own, there is a small intersection. That is the Industry 4.0 where I digitize my processes and I find out how well they're performing. And basis that, I can also understand what is my wastage that's coming from there. Can I improve that? Can I reduce my wastage? Can I improve the quality of my products? NLP, which was discussed again, I mean, the last panel had quite insightful discussions, and in that NLP was brought out where I'm reading through suppliers' policies and figuring out whether they're favorable for human rights. That is also a direct implication of how I can improve my ESG scores. If I onboard good suppliers, so I mean, who are kind to the environment, who are kind with the people they're working with. So there's a lot of things that a company can do than just simple carbon reduction or carbon capture. And those are the areas they need to focus, because as I mentioned before, the limiting factor over here is technology. I can only reduce by so and so as much as it is allowed in today's world. But beyond that, I need to start making other changes. And that is how we can start improving. So a brief view into how I can do that is I need to set targets. I mean, I need to set these specific KPIs. And basis that, I can put in targets to achieve. A target for the next 2 months, a target for the next 5 months, a target for the next 3 years, a target for the next 5 years. And accordingly, my reporting will increase, because make no errors, while the compliance is at a very nascent stage currently, it is going to get much stricter as we move forward. Right now, it is just, if you go through the set of questions, you will find out that they are very suggestive in nature. They're not really enforcing anything, but they're actually kind of pointing out to into areas where companies can start improving. If I were to look at much stricter standards, you have a GRI standard which is followed globally. You have a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, which looks at where the money is flowing and is that benefiting the environment, or SNG in any way. So for India to get at a global level where I can compete with my global suppliers, my global competitors, I need to start developing my ESG reports in those levels. BRSR is helping, but BRSR is a gateway for you to get to that level. So with this in mind, I would like to close the discussion from my side, but I would, furthermore, I would have more points to add, and depending on how the progress goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dattatra. I mean, you have brought out a few points which are very, very important, which we'll take up later again. So now I think we should go to our third speaker who is online, and he is Mr. Sudipto Ghosh from PwC. Sudipto, please.
Sure. So thank you very much, Professor Majumdar. I hope you are able to hear me and see me as well. Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk on a very interesting topic around data and analytics and the intersection or the enablement of ESG from a data and analytics perspective. So I'll share some thoughts and perspectives on the same. And because I have the advantage of speaking online, so I thought I will probably exploit that advantage and share some slides also with you, if that's okay. So this topic which we are speaking about, intersection of ESG and data and analytics, I wanted to talk about in a very specific way, three very specific interventions which is already happening in the industry, or there are many organizations are actually adopting it. So this is something which is straight, and I will talk about the ESG digital reporting platform, which is more around increasing the transparency, increasing the quality of the data and the disclosures, and also providing the starting framework for an organization to truly benchmark against its peers, as well as to track its improvements over a period of time. So basically, as the saying goes, what you measure gets improved. So the starting point is the measurement and disclosure and reporting of the same. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the carbon data lake. It is a little bit more technically advanced topic, but I'll speak for some time, where we are seeing organizations investing in figuring out how they can capture the data at source. I'll give you some examples for that. And the last but not the least uh, is the decarbonization planning engine, which probably is the need of the hour, given the fact that every organization is talking about a net zero or a negative GHG commitment. So from a reporting perspective, I think what is happening is that there are three specific activities which are happening. The first one is more around the collection of the data. So this is not something very new. We already had technologies for collecting the data in an automated manner, and the same thing is getting extended for the non-financial parameters, which the ESG, most of the ESG parameters are around that. And then the interesting thing about the next step, which is more on the data processing and calculations piece, is the fact that sometimes the quality of the presentation of the data is not that great. So when the quality isn't great, then we also need to look at some kind of profiling and check in order to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data. And then the other interesting piece is the fact that when you're looking at a particular KPI, which needs to be disclosed, like an emission from a specific source, you have different methodologies by which you can arrive at the same KPI. You can arrive that by looking at the input parameters and looking at the chemical reaction, and then figuring out if this is what the input is, then this is what should be the CO2 or the methane output based on the chemical reaction. And that's one way to calculate how much of emissions or direct emissions or scope 1 emission is happening. That's the easiest way. The other methodology is to actually have a sensor which captures the data at the point of exit, and that's another way to measure it. Sometimes the two do not reconcile with each other because of inconsistency. So while it sounds very simple, when you go to the mechanics of it, there could be possibilities of different methodologies, different formulas, which needs to be applied. So this is the place where you become a little more consistent in terms of how you are defining the matrices and how you are calculating those matrices. I wanted to give you a bit of a glimpse of how it is happening so that it doesn't remain a very abstract thought or an idea. So here you can see that to start with, you can look at the ESG parameters, which is very straightforward. You can also look at how you're progressing towards your net zero goals, because an organization may have already publicly stated that they want to go net zero by, say, 2035 or 2040. So you need to track based on what you have already promised. And then also there is a board or a stakeholder view which you would want to keep, so that if you want to have the right kind of stakeholder management across your investor community, or you're looking for cheaper sources of financing by way of green bonds, or by way of figuring out how you can have the right kind of investments from the private equity players, then that becomes an important aspect. Or if you're already an investee company of a PE, then this becomes almost a very important thing for you to do. Okay. And as we were looking at it, you can see that there is a lot which goes around the E, or the first aspect. It is about energy management, climate, air quality, waste, water. So a lot of parameters and sections can be there, which you may want to look at the business unit and the location level, and you actually look at it more in a graphical manner and in a very detailed tabular manner. Also, what is important is to look at some of the subjective elements as well, and some of these can come directly from questionnaires which you may want to kind of circulate in the rest of the organization. While we are talking about the E, let us also look at some of the social aspects as well, in terms of employee well-being, community welfare, human rights, strikes and other things which you want to measure and monitor. And then last but not the least is the overall governance in terms of ethics and BRSR mandates. As you know that BRSR has become a reality now. It is almost like a compliance which organizations will have to do, at least the top 1,000 BSE listed companies. streaming sources of data which can directly be captured, and we know that the data lake technology exists, which allows you to capture both in batch as well as in streaming from a streaming source data in one central place using one common data model and one common repository. So we want to extend the same framework even in the ESG space. And there, when you're looking at the data lake, you're looking at three different things. The first one is standardization and streamlining of the data collection process. Second is traceability. I think traceability is something which is very critical. We have always looked at data lineage and data traceability from a reporting standpoint, because you want to really validate if the number is showing what it is, what is the source of that data, and can it be traced back from where it has been taken from. And this traceability is something which is very critical even from an ESG perspective, because remember, some of these disclosures are happening to the regulators, to the external stakeholders, and hence it's important that people believe those numbers. And then the last bit is about the fact that you're not just creating a data lake for the sake of a data lake, you are actually embedding that in the context of a larger program around decarbonization initiatives. When you're looking at those initiatives or investments or different task forces who are responsible for delivering that, you want to have a place where you can very quickly monitor and see whether you are moving in the right direction. So now there is a build up. So this is another slide I thought I'll share with you, because this is something which gets into a little bit of a detail. I didn't want it to be very technical, but the only thing I would want to say here is that organizations are not building everything from scratch. There are already tools available from established vendors who are allowing these creation of reports and KPIs in a very standardized manner, and that's where some of the tools which you see in the slide is a reflection of the same. So while the task sounds very daunting, I think there are tools available in the market which allows you to jumpstart in that journey. And then moving on to the last bit, which is the interesting one, is that traditionally we have seen organizations getting into a planning process primarily for their financial matrices. Now we are also looking at planning which is not just financial but ESG matrices or non-financial planning as well. So how does that help you? So we are looking at specifically a decarbonization planning engine. As you know, organizations are already making a lot of statements about their net zero. And while it is great to say that we are going to be net zero, but it is important that that net zero target has to be dovetailed in the context of an integrated planning approach. For example, if I'm saying that my emission is going to go down, but on the other hand, my ambition is to increase my revenue by 20% or 30%, how am I going to reconcile these mutually opposing objectives? For that, I would need to have a integrated planning approach. What is helpful usually is a driver-based planning, where you're looking at the drivers for, say, CO2 or other challenges, and if you can break that cycle of those drivers which is causing that, then you have a better chance of achieving those plans. So you are looking at 4 different things as you are designing your pathway to net zero. You're looking to start with is the carbon footprint measurement, and we are looking at all the aspects. So scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 all gets measured. Then you are looking at the strategy and target setting. So you do have some targets which you are setting for this year, because you have to achieve something 5 years or 10 years down the line. So you're setting some target for this year. You don't want to wait for too long. And then you have a detailed planning initiative, which is what I call as the driver-based planning. So if this is what the target is and this is what your ambition is from a growth perspective, what are the drivers which is resulting in that kind of a scenario? And last aspect will be the variance analysis on a regular basis. So this is where we are seeing a lot of initiatives coming in from organizations, and I would like to kind of take a pause and wait for any questions at a later point in time. But I thought I'll share with you some of the perspectives of what is happening in the industry from a perspective of DNA enablement of ESG strategy for organizations.
Thanks. Like coal mines and power plants, okay? So they are directly related to this ESG. you know, some 3 decades back, we went to coal mines, okay? And there were both open cast and the bored coal mine. We visited there, I mean, the actual mining sites, and we found out the environment and the condition of the people. And then after the decade almost, we visited another coal mine in Ranchi area, which was open cast. And what they did was, there is a huge area where they started mining, and they started from a particular corner, okay? And after some time, when that corner is devoid of coal, they put this thing, I mean, the greenery they started, right? So when they complete the mining, the whole area is covered by greenery, okay? So that was one aspect which I have seen personally, okay? The other aspect was the visit to the power plants, okay? So initially what happened, I mean, about 40 years back or 50 years back, what was happening, the ash which was getting out of the power plant, they were actually there in almost everywhere around the site, and actually agriculture was impossible there, okay? So what the power plants did later on, they put the ESPs, okay, electrostatic precipitators, okay. So after doing that, actually the ash content of the gas outcome was almost nil, okay. And the ash was again used for the bricks, okay. So that is how that could be monetized, okay. So those are the two things I have seen. And recently I have visited a power plant which is Holdia Electric Limited, okay, a power plant of CESC Limited. Actually, CESC Limited is a larger group. There, if you go, you will not find anything other than plants, okay, and some flowers and all, okay. The complete area is surrounded by plants and lakes and all, right? They are using the rainwater harvesting. They are doing a complete lake they have created by rainwater harvesting, and using that water, they are running. Okay, so this is something which they are doing, and also they are going towards the villages which are outside the campus, and teaching the kids. Okay. So that way they are really doing something good for the environment and the social and of course the governance. So what I'm now interested is your take on the other two people, right? I mean, whatever they have said. Okay. Dr. Om Ghosh. Yeah.
Okay. In fact, one thing is very clear from, I guess, all of us, what we covered is, number one, data is an issue. But the key here is, because it's an issue for everybody, unlike in the past where people would want to hold whatever information and data you have and try to do things by yourself and etc., given the scale and magnitude of the problem, we cannot be just doing things on our own. Hence, two things are important. Number one is transparency, and number two is sharing. And that is why we see the emergence of, and I think both my other speakers also mentioned about the terms platforms. The emergence of this platform thing is happening, whereby whoever is capturing whatever data, capturing, calculating, measuring, whatever, trying to make it open and accessible to others so that others can benefit from that. So that's something which is very important. Now, of course, there are technical challenges. More importantly, there are challenges about standards. I mean, we spoke about ESG reporting. I mean, there are 600 plus organizations, each mandating different types of format, standards, and etc., which becomes confusing. And then, of course, the different types of data based on their source and etc. They don't talk to each other, don't have the context and etc. Right? But that's where we see the emergence of a lot of these platforms coming up, whereby people are sharing. And I will give you one example. You spoke about your power plant experiences where people are again replacing with plants and etc. Right? Almost in the same field, the transmission, as you know, the transmission line as it goes from the power plants to the distribution units and to the consumers and etc., it goes through fields, forests and whatever else, right? And one of the biggest challenges of that had been that you will have to, if there are say forests in between the transmission path, you'll have to chop trees and etc. And typically the way it used to be done in the past is, I mean, even if you chop the trees, they will again grow. So periodically the companies will have to go and chop the trees again and etc. They will most probably reduce it to a level which was not required and etc. Right? With the focus on green and ensuring we have enough vegetation and etc. around, there are platforms available whereby using satellite pictures and AI, ML and the type of technologies whereby you can see how the trees are growing, number one, and then when do you really need to prune the trees to avoid disruption. Even before that, as you plan the layout of your transmission lines, how do you design it so that you impact it less and etc. Right? And again, that is something which is being shared with others because it's not just one party involved. And what we have seen, there are customers who, because they have this capability today, they are getting the right to serve or transmit electricity in countries which are more rigorous in these activities. So that's helping them with the business. And more importantly, because they are affecting the population less, they get a positive vibes from the consumers as well. Enough data about everything that we are doing, but usage of IoTs and etc. we can most probably measure and then extrapolate and etc. Right? On the social side, I mean, for instance, the flowers that are here, we don't know whether in producing or growing those flowers, a child labor was used or not. Right? And if somebody was using it, they wouldn't have reported it or declared it. Right? So finding those sort of information becomes even more difficult. I mean, of course, there are companies who are trying to do validations and etc. physically, manually. And that is where, again, platforms like Ethics and others have come up who would scan, I mean, lots of other information, structured, unstructured, and etc., and trying to figure out if there were reports of you using something, some news item came over, or there were some posts somewhere else, and etc. And then warn, and then predict and prevent those sort of vendors from being used in the corporate supply chain, for instance, right? And again, this is not something somebody can do on alone or one enterprise can do on alone. That's why the sharing and transparency, coming to our standards and using platforms and etc. is something which is emerging.
So, while I completely agree that data is a challenge that is there currently, getting the right data out, I believe that as and more the technology progresses, more amount of data will come out and that will give us more insights as to what is actually happening. Now that leads to two questions. Is my company well positioned to adopt that data? Do I have the capital or the capability to adopt the data? And second, do I have the right intent to use the technology to the extent it allows me to? On the capability part is something I would like to get into. There are perhaps very few companies who can adopt the best in-class technologies to capture the right data. But on the intent part is something which I'd like to focus on. Now, targets will obviously have to be set at the topmost level, that these are your targets that any department needs to achieve. This is the reduction you need to do. This is the wastage levels you need to achieve at every level. Now, if I impose that target on departments, then maybe it's an added burden to them, apart from already meeting their current outputs. So rather than just asking them to do it,
Not been able to hear clearly. If
No.
somebody can type the message in the chat window.
Can you hear us, Sudipto?
Yeah, yeah, it is. If you can, yeah, yeah, I can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. So essentially, what I wanted to know is your comments on what the other two panelists have said.
Yeah, so I've not been able to kind of hear very clearly, but if you can, I mean, in terms of the way I see it panning out is that uh, uh, the the data is going to be very critical in terms of figuring out what we should be able to achieve in the ESG. So there is a lot of concern in terms of whether the right data is getting published by these organizations or not, and whether the data is material enough or not to really make that difference. So that is one aspect which is important. The second aspect which is important is the entire focus on the future, but how that future translates to present. And there are two challenges there. One is that if you have to shift your technology from or a conversion technology or a processing technology from A to B, because B is more environmentally friendly, then what are the costs associated with that transition of technology? And here I'm not talking about IT technology, I'm talking about the core technology, the manufacturing technology, the conversion technology. So the costs associated with that technology. Secondly, if the technology still remains the same, but you want to replace your sources of energy from conventional to non-conventional sources, then what are the risks associated with that, and also the costs associated with that. And then there would be an ambition to grow and to be more profitable. So that's the third aspect. And the fourth aspect is that, of course, you want to have an overall reduction in the emissions. So if you take all these four factors into consideration, it's a fairly complex jigsaw puzzle for you to solve. And that is where an integrated end-to-end planning will be very critical. And this is pretty much long-range planning I'm talking about, because these solutions will not be solved in 1-2 years time. You have to look at a 5-year or a 10-year horizon. That's the second aspect. The third aspect is looking at specific point interventions where you can disclose or you can educate people in your own organization where they can possibly make a difference. For example, if a certain practice reduces the scope 2 or the scope 3 emission, you would like that to be shared with your employees or with your ecosystem players like suppliers and customers, so that they can do something which is going to have a positive impact. Everybody wants to do well and good for the environment, but they may not know which action will be more material as opposed to which action which is not. And that classification can only come from the way the data gets presented to them. So that's the third aspect which is important. And the fourth aspect, and then I will kind of take a pause, is that whatever we have learned in the world of data and analytics in terms of getting a single version of truth, in terms of getting the right lineage or traceability, in terms of looking at the leading indicators or the predictive indicators, in terms of doing a much better planning and forecasting, all of that possibly needs to be applied in a very focused way, because that will be the need of the hour, and we don't want to be found wanting in that space, because the tools and techniques are there with us to help us navigate through this complexity.
Thank you, Sudipto. So we are almost at the closing point. Just one or two comments from my side. Actually, the environment, social, and governance. Okay. So what I have, learned from these three gentlemen, it's really the attitude which matters. The attitude of the top management which matters. right now we don't have dearth of technology or dearth of profitability, but in the long run, I mean long-term sustainability, it depends on the ESG. Okay, so it is. I think it is more important to have a positive attitude towards ESG and not only compliance. Okay, wherever there is compliance, there is problem, right? We want to fuzz the different data and all. So essentially, it should not be taken as compliance issue, but a sustainability issue. So if we take that view in mind, then of course this particularly ESG can be very helpful to the society as well as to the corporation.
Can I make a comment over
Yeah,
there, because
please.
you have made a very important
Please.
thing there. So we did a research with the CEOs, and we asked them the question that, do you take ESG as a cost? And there was a stark difference between the CEOs in India vis-a-vis the CEOs globally. So when we looked at the results from the overall global research data, we found that most of the organizations thought it as a compliance burden or an addition of cost. Whereas if you looked at the response of most of the Indian CEOs or organizations in India, we found that they were looking at ESG more as a differentiator, more as an area where they can innovate their products and services. And just a case in example is that if you are, say, manufacturing glass, how can you use glass as a construction material, because that reduces your carbon footprint, because you're not going to use cement because cement is very polluting, and that's the positioning they want to do, thinking very creatively that how can they make their products more aspirational so that people are being more friendly to the environment. So that was a very distinct, stark difference. And the trend is more that ESG is being looked at more as a differentiator rather than just as a cost or a compliance burden.
Okay, thank you, Sudipto. Would you like to add something?
Actually, adding on to what Mr. Sudipto pointed out, globally, I think there are 54% of the top think tank, top management feel that ESG is probably important and is a necessity. 54%, that's not a very high number. In contrast, there are 88% of investors feel ESG is a huge factor in what they decide to invest. So that is one indicator. And as you rightly pointed out, the intent needs to come from the top management. And at the same time, the execution has to happen at a ground level. So for that, the incentives also need to come so that they are also aligned to that thought process. And he rightly pointed out, ESG is going to be an enabler for you to differentiate amongst your competitors and at the same time improve your profits, because ESG automatically ensures you're optimizing your processes. ESG automatically ensures you're going to reduce your wastage. So my cost is automatically getting lowered. So these are some added benefits that you will definitely face and something you can obviously adopt at a very minimal cost. Perhaps your initial minimal cost is going to be low, but eventually you're going to find out that with this constant reporting as well as compliance is going to become a DNA of the organization.
Thank you. I think now we can go to the audience. Any questions or comments on the discussion? The mic.
Well, I have an interesting observation in the entire discussion, you see. Professor Mojumdar has mentioned about big industries. Okay, their environmental problem is much more. As such, in the morning he delivered a lecture on big data. So you are generating a lot of data. Lot of data means lot of analysis. Lot of analysis means lot of computation. Lot of computation means lot of carbon footprint. Okay? So all of you are very sorry that data is not available. Now suppose the data is available. If all the data is available, again that generates all over the country or all over the around the globe, huge amount of data. Huge amount of data means huge amount of computation. Huge amount of computation means addition to the footprint. That means addition to your data. And you take that data, again you generate carbon footprint, again you add to your data. So net zero is a dream. It is asymptotically going towards zero, never reaching zero. Thank you.
So you reduce your energy, okay. That is the energy requirement of the data center by adopting new technology. Then the carbon footprint will be reduced. Thank you, sir. Any other?
I can actually, yeah. So you're absolutely right. Data centers take up a huge amount of carbon, have a huge carbon footprint and huge carbon emissions that come with data centers. And I was reading an article where you need to draw a balance between how much analytics you do and how much carbon it's releasing. Absolutely. But I think there are two things that will come out. One, the more shared resources you use, the concept of cloud, which is a shared data warehouse, data sourcing, is perhaps going to collectively reduce from what it could actually be. Second, the insights I get from those data analytics is probably also going to compensate for the data I'm going to, for the emissions I'm going to release from my data centers, because those insights can actually help drastically reduce my carbon emissions across multiple processes, not just for the core process. So that would be my answer to the question, but absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Any other question from anybody else? Okay, so I thank all the panelists for their thoughtful presentations, and a lot of new points were there in the discussions. I think the main takeaway from these discussions are like the kind of ESG which is possible, the technology which are there for compliance, and of course the attitude. Okay, so with this I close this session, and possibly we have complied with the time limit, right? Okay.
Thank you, sir. And we began on a pretty sultry note. The weather has cooled down as well, so that's a positive as well. So we now move towards the felicitation program. I would like to invite Professor Chandan Majumdar, who is the panel coordinator, to kindly felicitate the others. No, we would ask you to felicitate the others. First up, we have Mr. Dattatreya Datta. Thank you, sir. And up next, we have Dr. Anup K. Ghosh. With that, we come to an end of the panel discussion. We would like to thank all our panelists and the panel moderator, coordinator for this wonderful and fruitful session.